Good evening. My name is Andrea Kessler from Wilson College. I'm the academic fieldwork coordinator. And on behalf of the Philadelphia Region Fieldwork and Capstone Consortium, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. For those who may not be familiar, the consortium is comprised of 9 local institutions dedicated to supporting OT and OTA programs, students, and fieldwork sites through shared knowledge, evidence, and resources. We'd like to extend a special thank you to Temple University's College of Public Health for organizing this event. We appreciate them for hosting on their webinar platform and providing behind the scenes support. Great big thank you. I have a few housekeeping notes. If you could please mute yourself. And a Q&A feature is available and we will moderate that. And you can see that Jeannie and Kelly have responded. I'll be responding to your questions. But Dr. Gohean will address questions at the end of the session. Please complete the brief post-webinar survey that we have. We'll post a link in the chat. We also have a QR code at the end for you. A special reminder that in order to get PDU credit, you will need to remain on the webinar throughout the entire time. So please remember that. Presentation slides, as I saw, came through the chat, and the recording will be available on our website. So without further ado, tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Courtney Gohean, who will present on perceptions of academic fieldwork coordinators, fieldwork educators, and OT students with accommodations. Dr. Gohean serves as the academic fieldwork coordinator for the Master of Science in Occupational Therapy program at Thomas Jefferson University. She brings nearly 2 decades of clinical experience across acute care, inpatient rehabilitation, and older adult outpatient settings. Dr. Gohean earned her doctorate in higher education at Westchester University, and her scholarship focuses on fieldwork accommodations for students with disabilities. Her recent accomplishments include receiving a Nexus grant and presenting at the 2025 AOTA conference. Dr. Gohean is actively engaged in institutional and regional committees that promote student success, wellness, and innovation in OT education. Wonderful. We are so happy to have you here. And thank you so much, everyone else, for joining us. We can get started.
Thank you. Okay, I can't see anybody, and it's so hard to present and not see faces. I'm just looking at my screen, so I will try to connect through my heart and my words here. So I want to just reiterate, the gratitude to have you all here. This is a passion topic of mine, and I'll get into a little bit of why on the next slide. Or in 2 slides, I should say. So the objectives tonight are to talk about the significance of why we want to provide accommodations during level 2 fieldwork. We'll talk about the research that's out there. I will share a little bit about my doctoral study and also a Delphi study that I did about a year ago. We'll talk about some best practices. I have some very kind of hands-on things educators can walk away from, and coordinators too. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about some examples of accommodations and then open it up for discussion. So why this research? I was thinking to myself, oh gosh, I hope I don't get emotional. When I first talked about my why, when I was doing my dissertation defense, I did get emotional. 4 years ago, I took this job as a coordinator at Jefferson in the master's program. I was just a clinician before that, or I shouldn't say just a clinician, but I came into the role with no experience being a coordinator, but I definitely had a ton of students and then was a new grad mentor for several years as well. But I kind of jumped right into it. And before I knew it, I had a student with accommodations, and they were detailed or complex accommodations, and I felt so ill-equipped. And then at the same time, because I now entered academia, they kind of push you to get your doctorate. And so the timing really aligned for me to be able to figure out how to learn about accommodations and then while also getting my doctorate. And this one, my very first student in the program that had accommodations, it was hard. And so, it was very easy for me to want to learn and do better. So that's my why. And anytime you read an article about accommodations in health professions, the first, the introduction in almost every article says there's an increasing number of students with disabilities entering health professions or entering college. So we know that. And so within the OT profession and OT programs, we're seeing students with disabilities more often. And there is this ethical responsibility to create equal access to education. And it helps our profession, to have a variety of clinicians offering care. And then we have to consider there's legal context to accommodations. I'll talk about that. And I do want to note that when I talk about the research in this presentation, a lot of the research that I did in my dissertation spanned many health professions, not just OT, because when I started doing my literature review 2 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of OT-based accommodations in fieldwork literature. So I'll talk about like a study in the nursing field, a study with physical therapy, midwifery. So I really, ran the whole gamut and, just read a lot about accommodations in the clinical setting. Quick background to set us up for the rest of the talk. There's a few primary key players when we're talking about accommodations for fieldwork. That's people like me who are the academic fieldwork coordinators. There's fieldwork educators, and then there's the students. We can also consider the site coordinators and people in the academic institution that write those accommodations letters. They're called DRPs, Disability Resource Professionals. So we just have to think that, there's many players in this puzzle. The other thing we should address is I will often use identity first language, such as disabled students. I will interchange it with students with disabilities. It's a conscious decision to choose both. You can ask me about that later if you want to. There is quite a bit of research on just language alone. And I don't think either one is wrong, and you can use them interchangeably. It's what's your intention with it, right? How do you use that language with good intention? And the word accommodation in this context is just going to be about that modification of a task for the students in fieldwork. We just want to acknowledge too, there are certain laws that protect the students' rights to equal access to education, and that education does filter into the clinic. The other thing we have to consider, especially for sites, when you're thinking about the institution side and the student side, is something called FERPA. So we are not allowed to disclose students' personal information related to academics. It's like the school version of HIPAA. So the ADA definitions for disability. So it's a person, you have to qualify for a disability in order to get accommodations. Okay, this is the definition. It's a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. They have to have a record of it. and it's perceived by others as having such an impairment. And that's, really just a formality if you don't know this already. One of the big terms we have to think about when we're talking about accommodations in fieldwork is essential functions. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. I have to slow myself down. In the context of accommodations for fieldwork, you have to think, okay, well, the student's coming into my clinic and we have a 12-week schedule, hopefully, and the student has to do certain things week by week to be a competent therapist and meet the essential job functions. Oftentimes, when I'm trying to help a student figure out accommodations, or we're at least just talking about them, I can ask a site, hey, what's your employee's essential job functions? And so we can kind of look at those and tease those out to help figure out what accommodations might be needed based on the essential job functions. So when I dove into the literature, these were the key findings. So I can give you this like quick snapshot, but it is so meaty, and it's almost sad that I have to just do this in one slide, but it's okay. The fact is that disabled students in the health professional programs are underrepresented, and they do in fact have lower success rates. Okay. We have plenty of literature that shows there are barriers to clinical education for these students. They face marginalization, ableism, disabling discourse, and discrimination. There's plenty of evidence on that, unfortunately. I cited 3 here, but it's plentiful. There's also research out there that shows that there's limited clinical education awareness and training. We know that already with just the lack of training we give to fieldwork educators when they take students. AOTA offers this fieldwork educator certificate course, but that's it. That's pretty much it. So, and there is a section in that course on accommodations, but there needs to be so much more than that. There's a lot of information in the literature on disclosure. There's so many topics under that big umbrella, but I can talk to you a little bit about what the 2 studies found that I did in terms of disclosure. And there are barriers to students obtaining accommodations, whether that's like a staffing, cost, or resource situation, or if it's, again, lack of educator training or academic fieldwork coordinator training, a lack of transparency. There's a ton of barriers, and we'll get into that because the 2 studies that I'll talk about find that there are barriers as well. Okay, just another kind of formality slide about workplace accommodations. So adjustments to the job application process. So if you think about fieldwork in this context, we have to think how we're supporting students to choose level 2 sites, interview for level 2 sites, and then on board for those level 2 sites if they have accommodations. We have to consider modifications to the physical work environment and the way a job is usually performed. It's, that lens of this is how it's done. This is how we do a transfer, right? We bend our knees and keep our back straight, and this is how the transfer is done. But this idea that a student can be deemed competent if they can verbalize the proper steps to a transfer, and they would be deemed competent even though they didn't physically transfer the client. And then changes that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal access. In terms of ADA limitations, the law does require the employer or the site or the academic institution to provide reasonable accommodations as long as they fall under that criteria that I just talked about, unless it changes the essential job function or um, it causes undue hardship for the employer. So sometimes, like in law cases, like the cost of like an interpreter or something like that has been discussed as maybe a hardship. Okay, so we'll go into my dissertation research first. It was a mixed method. I think this slide should have gone second now that I think about it, but the research study that I did last year was a mixed method study, and it included surveys from the fieldwork educators. That was the quantitative piece. And then the qualitative piece was interviews with the disabled students that had accommodations during level twos or new grads, and academic fieldwork coordinators who supported students with disabilities during level twos. So when I created my survey for the fieldwork educators, I wanted to, like, I had all of this research in the back of my mind, thinking about a lack of training, a lack of transparency, disability disclosure issues, um, ableism. So I used all of that to create the survey questions and this research question. So I wanted to know what the relationships were between the demographic characteristics of the educators and their perceptions of what is equitable, feasible, their level of confidence, and the beliefs about the success of OT students. And then for the qualitative piece, I did interviews with those academic fieldwork coordinators and the disabled students, and basically just wanted to know what their experience was like. So this slide just talks about the methods design. For the quantitative data, I used a 26-item questionnaire. And then, like I said, the interviews with the coordinators and the students, they were semi-structured, so loosely directed questions, if you will. Okay, we can skip that. It's not fun. All right. So quantitative results. I will say right off the bat, this part of my study was weak in that there were only 45 educators that completed my survey. So sorry to say. I think I had 150 at first, but most of them were incomplete, so I couldn't use them. So you have to take this with a grain of salt, but also with an open mind. So remember that overarching research question was, do they think students can be successful, and are accommodations fair and important, yada, yada. So the first question that I want to point out to you, if you look at this slide, it's the upper left. The question asks the educators, do they think accommodations are fair and important? Look, in the yellow, most people are saying yes. And you would think that, right? But there's this small subset, 2 of the 45, which, it's present, the number is there, that says no, that they don't think that accommodations are fair and important. The next question asked the educators whether they thought the accommodations were effective in relation to students succeeding. And you have the majority again answering positively, saying yes, they can be very effective or effective. But if you look again, this is the bottom left hand of the slide, you have, this subset that is saying they're not effective or they're very ineffective. And when I look at these numbers, I automatically want to say, why? What happened? But we don't have that information, unfortunately. All right, I asked the educators what their confidence was with implementing these accommodations, because when I looked into the literature, there was this huge study in the nursing field that asked nursing preceptors, about accommodations and supporting nursing students with accommodations. And the biggest report from the preceptors was that they didn't feel trained and confident. So I said, okay, I want to know because listen, I went into my job. I'm an OT of 20 years. I know about disability, but I went into my job. I did not know much about accommodations when I came into this role. So I thought it was a very valid question. And, there's a very positive response here. A lot of people are saying they're very confident with implementing accommodations. But again, there's that subset. Um, I won't get ahead of myself, but hopefully I can remember to bring this back to the qualitative results. All right, so one of the last questions was what are the educators' perceptions about OT students and their ability to be successful practitioners? And the majority said, yes, we strongly agree these people can be successful. But again, we're just noting that there's some neutrality or disagreement with that statement. I'm sorry, this clip is a little bit blurry. In the survey for the fieldwork educators, I asked them what their most frequent challenges were. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you're going to see that productivity demands and students not demonstrating adequate skills are the most frequently reported challenges. All right, so switching gears into the qualitative data. I did semi-structured interviews with 7 academic fieldwork coordinators, and then I did another 7 interviews with disabled students that had accommodations during level 2 fieldwork, or they were like recent new grads within 2 years. And there were 7 of those folks too. So there were, I want to say like 6 themes that came of the student and new grad data. The first was this, I want to say of the 7 interviews, each student was referencing 2 fieldworks, right? 2 level 2 fieldworks. And all 7 participants shared to some degree about this accommodations process and requesting accommodations. One student said they were given the wrong email from their academic fieldwork coordinator to the Office of Accessibility. They were sending follow-up emails for over a month trying to get a meeting with this office, and they didn't realize they had the wrong email. And that's just one small example, but a challenge nonetheless in an already challenging process. This participant says requesting accommodations was actually pretty difficult. Unfortunately, the accommodation department at my school decided that fieldwork was not their responsibility, and so I had to figure it out on my own. This particular participant did go to an OT program where there was no office, or I'm sorry, there was an office of accessibility, but they did not provide accommodations for students in the clinical realm. So the student was told that she had to figure it out on her own by the school and by the academic fieldwork coordinator. The second theme that came up was this theme of disability disclosure, and I had mentioned that was a frequent theme in the literature under this entire topic. And there are just so many different things to say about disability disclosure, but the bottom line that I want to share with you tonight is that students disclosed their disabilities in a variety of ways. Some students went to the site before their fieldwork began and gave the disclosure in person. Some students sent an email. Some students Zoomed with the site and their academic fieldwork coordinator and did a collaborative disclosure. Some academic fieldwork coordinators just sent the accommodations letter to the site. It is so varied. This participant, in relation to this theme, shared, I knew I needed to be a part of the conversation because I wouldn't be doing this for the rest of my life. I didn't know all the ins and outs, but I knew more about my disability than they did. I mean, this is like a dream situation where we have the student that is owning it and wants to be a part of that process. And, oftentimes when I was a clinician and a new clinician, and I was working with like spinal cord injury patients, I remember saying to myself, wow, and it was an older spinal cord injury. So it was not a new spinal cord injury for the patient, but he would come into the hospital, or he or she or they would come into the hospital. And I remember just asking them so many questions. They were teaching me on how to do transfers and how they did ADLs and things like that. When you have a student like this who is articulate and willing to advocate, they can teach us, but in my experience, that's a rarity, unfortunately. So the third theme was fieldwork educators' role in accommodation implementation. Students' experiences were deeply influenced by fieldwork educators' perceived support. So the student shared, I didn't want to be seen as an incapable, so I held back from using my accommodations at first, even though I needed them. And there were, of the 7 students, I think there were probably like 4 different field works where the students needed rest breaks for food or medicine or rest. And every single one of them didn't use their accommodations to their full ability. They felt like it was too busy. They had to meet productivity. They felt bad asking. They didn't know when to ask. Like if you're in a busy clinic, you know, they just didn't feel empowered to ask, or they just didn't know when the appropriate time to implement a rest break would be. So the next theme was student well-being. This could be a theme for any level 2 fieldwork, but the students described how the accommodations process and the fieldwork educators' responses impacted their well-being. This particular student shared it was a very huge strain on my mental and physical well-being because I just felt constantly I was not supported and I was not necessarily being disciplined, and I was receiving very negative language. On the other hand, I had this one participant who she was like legally blind or had low vision to a significant degree. And her first setting, it seemed like it was like a non-traditional school setting. And they had, for the kids at the school, they had these assisted devices that would help with communication. But the participant, the OT student with accommodations, couldn't see that assistive device. And so the educator ended up just, not having the student use it. And so therefore there was, a gap in connection and rapport with the OT student and the students at the school. This particular student also mentioned that she got a sense from her educator that her educator was not comfortable with using disability language and talking about the OT student's disability. This student was, very articulate and competent in, what she needed and things like that. That was her sense. The student passed that field work, and but it just was I got the impression that could have been so much more, and that there was probably a lack of comfort, confidence, training, all those things. The student then went to a hand site, and this educator, the student disclosed to this hand site. The educator um, told her boss, and the boss said, you know, well, she can't see. How's that going to work? And the, oh, it always gets me. I did not want to do this. The educator said, well, we're OTs, we're going to figure it out. The OT, the educator, had a husband who was a welder, and the student couldn't see the goniometer. And the educator's husband, who was the welder, welded some goniometer for this, disabled student. And, it was just this approach that was completely nice. Oh, I cannot believe I'm crying. That is terrible. I can't help it. I am just a crier at baseline. So anyway, it was so fascinating to, we can look at this in one way, and we can look at it in the opposite spectrum, meaning if we go into this accommodations topic for fieldwork with an open mind and being curious and saying we can try, then that's great. And if it doesn't work, if the student doesn't meet the competencies, then that's that. But it's this idea that we're going to open up our minds to support the student, to give them an opportunity to learn. So sorry about that. Wow. All right, last theme is the recommendations for improvement in the accommodations process. So in every interview, the students would say, oh, I wish my school did this. I wish my school did that. A lot of suggestions related to the academic institution's process on accommodations, because again, remember that first theme was most everybody had challenges with trying to figure out how to get accommodations for field work, or what accommodations to ask for and stuff like that. Okay, so to the coordinators, I interviewed 7 academic fieldwork coordinators. One was from an OTA program. And there were 4 themes that came from these interviews. And the first was the need for advanced planning. So here's the caveat with this. We can't advance plan if the student doesn't disclose. Why don't students disclose? Well, there's a bunch of reasons I said, but if we can create as institutions an environment where it's like, let's explore, let's be curious, let me talk to you about it early and often, early first semester, second semester. If we can open that door to the student to feel like a discussion can be had, I feel like we're winning, you know? And just having the student come to me and say, hey, I know you talked about accommodations, like, can we talk about it? And right off the bat, I'll tell them, you don't have to disclose to the site. But for me, I want to be able to find out what they need. I need to know as much as I can about what they need so I can place them in a site that fits. But again, we can't advance plan if the student doesn't disclose. But it is so helpful for everybody. And the educators, in the literature and in my survey, they want a heads up. Okay. And I do tell my students that in the first semester, in the second semester, in the third semester, hey, I can tell you that fieldwork sites want to know about accommodations early on. Everybody wants to be able to prepare and ask questions. And so if you don't disclose in a timely fashion, that could be seen a certain way. And I understand that, from a site perspective. The second theme was there were challenges in translating classroom accommodations to fieldwork. So a couple common classroom accommodations are reduced distraction environment for exams, extended time for exams. Maybe we're posting modules for students early. Those are some common ones. But how does that actually translate to the field work? Because you can't write in the accommodations letter extended time for exams. The thing that we have to think about, I think, really a lot here is that sometimes the students don't have a diagnosis until college, and they're just trying to navigate all that on their own and what they're capable of. But also to ask the student, and I found this in my interviews with coordinators, to ask the student to be responsible for articulating their accommodations for fieldwork, I think is a big ask because they've never been there. You know, how do they know what a hospital-based pediatric site is like? You know, and I don't think the Office of Accessibility is, those people that write the accommodations letters in the institutions. I don't think they always know what OT is and what specific sites are either. So what I did was when I came into the job, basically for 2 years, and whenever I had a student with accommodations, I would meet with that Office of Accommodations person. She's lovely. And I'd say, hey, here's the student. We'll look at the classroom accommodations. I already know where the student like prefers to go setting wise, and we'll kind of like just talk about what the challenges could be, you know? And at this point, I don't need to meet with them anymore, the Office of Accommodations, because I've done it so many times that she knows. Yeah. So, but anyway, the point is that I don't know if the student knows what extended time for exams looks like in the clinic, And so it's our jobs as coordinators, I think, to, help educate them. And I think it's the Office of Accessibility, or, there's different names for that office, but it's their job too. Um, so the third theme was there was an importance of student self-advocacy. I loved this, and I don't think I held on to this self-advocacy piece when I was navigating this role in the beginning. I acted more like a advocate than promoting student self-advocacy. So this part of the research results was amazing for me to grow. Um, but if you think about it, we want the students to be independent in how to articulate their needs for their accommodations. And, similar to what I was just saying is I don't think we can necessarily expect them to be independent and self-advocating in the beginning, because I don't think they know what the clinic looks like. And if they have a newer diagnosis, um, they may not be able to articulate that. And I'm just going to throw in another fact here is that when you have a student with a disability under 18, the the school system manages and leads those accommodations. Once the student gets to 18 and enters college, it now flips and it's all on the student. So they have to navigate a process that they're not familiar with. They are now in the leadership role for their disability, and maybe they always sat in the back seat for that, when they were 18 and under. So um, I think we can think about this as OTs and say, how can as a coordinator, how can I help my student become more independent in this? And, I think some of that is giving them the literature. There's, a few articles you could give the student on um, the fieldwork educators per perspectives on accommodations, and um, like the Ask Jan website is a good one to try to figure out what accommodations they need. But anyway, the fourth theme is mixed reactions from fieldwork sites. So academic fieldwork coordinators described variable responses from fieldwork sites. Some sites were accommodating, collaborative, while others expressed resistance due to perceived time constraints, feasibility issues, or discomfort with disability. So, this participant said, some fieldwork educators do not want a student with a disability. I'm too busy. It's too much extra work. I don't want it. Um, I think I actually, I know I had one participant say in relation to the mixed reactions from fieldwork sites that they just know how it's going to go based on the first conversation. So you can kind of get, an impression. We can get impressions from people from fieldwork sites on, the openness or the willingness, the availability of taking a student with accommodations. Actually, with that student, my very first student that I had, and this is part of why, I'm so passionate about it, is because this student that I had, my very first student with an accommodation, she was stellar. She was sat in the front of the class, raised her hand all the time, was an A student. She was second career. She was so mature. Like you couldn't want a better student. And she had visual and cognitive deficits because, well, I don't want to go into too much detail, but when she wanted a hospital and she wanted a hand site, and I got her a hand slot. Then I disclosed the disability with the site. I said the student requires accommodations. Would you be willing to meet? After the site gave me the slot, and the sites responded back and said, I don't think this is a good idea. We'll try another time. We have the educator that we had assigned is new. And that was just an experience that I put under my belt. I appreciate the honesty, but it was like, wow, this isn't an easy thing. And then, this student wanted a hospital, and I grew up in a hospital based, like I worked in a hospital for like 10 years, and I still have threads of ableism in me. I can catch my brain thinking that way. And when I was navigating trying to place this student in a hospital, and the student needed reduced distractions and a quiet environment for like documentation, and we know the hospital's super busy. We know there's 10 things going on at one time. How's this going to work, But it's not my job to jump from A to Z like that. That's not fair. So we did a site visit, again, just trying to learn as much as possible and trying to have the student see this is what's going to be required. Do you think that you can do this? But the site was discriminatory right in front of our faces, and it was really sad. I just, but so I just walked away from that saying, I don't want to put you here even if they had a slot, because I want to set you up for success in a supportive environment. And so again, back to this theme of mixed reactions, yeah, I think I just am asking that we keep an open mind. And there are some things that are going to be reasonable, and there are some things that are not going to be reasonable. And when we are wondering whether or not the accommodations are fair, you have to go to the essential job functions. Is this really going to impact the central job functions? And there's your answer, you know? Um, okay. All right. So just from a data integration standpoint, so just looking at the students' themes and the coordinators' themes, both said early planning and disclosure were universally described as crucial for success. So then some of the new grads were saying in their interviews that they wish they would have disclosed earlier. And then the fieldwork educator responses range from supportive to resistant, reflecting mixed site receptivity. Um, oh, here's the point that I wanted to bring back from that quantitative data. So remember when I was telling you, I asked the fieldwork educators if they were confident in implementing accommodations and theoretically were OTs, like we're kind of comfortable with that content. Um, but many of the students reported, despite the high number of confidence with these educators, most of the students reported that their accommodations were not fully implemented. Like the one example with that student that had low vision with the hand sight, like that was probably 25% of the cases, where it was just super supportive and open. Okay. So just limitations on the study. There was a small sample size for the educators. We talked about that. The geographical region was primarily Northeast. We want to represent the whole country. I wasn't able to do that. My questionnaire that I created based on the literature did not go through reliability and validity testing. Attrition basically means like that idea that I had a lot of surveys, but from the fieldwork educators, but they weren't fully completed, so I couldn't use those surveys. Um, Potential selection and response bias just basically means like somebody who's going to participate in a research study might be more likely to answer a certain way or have a certain perception. So we have to consider that. And unfortunately, I didn't do interviews with educators. I really chose to do surveys because I know they're so busy. So I'm not trying to take, an hour out of their time. I was worried I wasn't going to get enough participants if I did interview educators. So I was like, let me just do a quick survey. And it's still hard. Yeah, I think it just underlines like, well, I don't know. I won't say I don't know. All right, implications for practice. So I think we'll just do education across the board for everybody, whether it's the disability resource professional in our institution that doesn't know about OT, or if it's educating the student on the accommodations process or the educator on accommodations. And it's very clear that schools need to adopt a clear, more transparent process for accommodations, acquiring accommodations and developing those. Um, Programs must support early education for students. Okay, so just as coordinators, our job is to talk about accommodations in the clinical environment, give examples of what that looks like so that the students can start to say, oh, yes, I'm going to need that. Okay, I'm going to talk to my coordinator about that. All right, switching gears. We're doing great on time. Switching gears to the Delphi study. So about a year and a half ago, myself and two colleagues did this Delphi study, and basically it's like a 3-round study. The first round is you ask these experts in the field. The experts are OTs, OTAs with disabilities. They're um, OTA students with disabilities. They're coordinators. There's researchers that have actually done research on this topic, and university disability staff. So we had this our one participant is so um, highly knowledgeable and does a lot of research in this topic. And he was one of our participants. It was glorious. So in the first round of the Delphi study, you basically ask people questions on what they think the best practices for accommodations are in level 2 field work. Then you get that data back. You analyze it for themes. Okay, I think we had 52 themes after that first round. And then you say, okay, everybody, here are the 52 themes that came up in your answers. Or I shouldn't say 52 themes, I'll say 52 best practices. Please rate them importance and feasibility. Feasibility, like, is this really feasible for your setting? Like, if there was an accommodation on lifting restriction and you're in an acute rehab, that's affecting the essential job function. So that's not going to work. So is the accommodation feasible? Is this practice feasible? So we sent that out for a second round. Then we look at the data and see how they're rating the feasibility importance of these accommodations, these 52. And then you get a score based on a statistical analysis saying, okay, these best practices have reached a consensus. And then you do a third round for tweaks. And so I have in the next slide a list of best practices that coordinators can do, that educators can do, that students can do, that programs can do, and that the DRPs could do. So this is like, I think probably the meatiest part where you can just walk away and be like, okay, these are the things I need to do or consider. Those are the 6 themes you can look at. I'm going to go to the next slide though, and just give you the top 10. Um, oops. Okay. So fieldwork, so top 10 best practices that received the most consensus for importance and feasibility. Importance meaning the accommodation is really important. Feasibility meaning this is doable in my site. So fieldwork educators set and communicate clear expectations for the student about the skills. Remember when we talked about how some educators are like, I don't know how to balance expectations versus providing accommodations. And you have to, as an educator, you have to look at that 12-week schedule and see if the student's meeting it. There's like a scaffolded progression where, the student is supposed to be. So you use that as your marker. But as an educator, you can clearly use that document, I think, and just say, okay, this is where you're supposed to be, and there's gray area to that, but the point is that we're communicating clear expectations. And I know my students meet with their educators every week, and they have like a form they fill out, and they do all the feedback, and there's actually an explicit checkbox that says, is this student on track? But the next one is fieldwork educators provide students with positive feedback, not only critical feedback. It goes without saying, but I think sometimes when I was an educator, it was, unfortunately, I was probably trying to work on making them better, but it helps to just reinforce to us all that it's important to balance. Because, you know, I think all students just benefit from positive feedback to help them with their well-being. Academic fieldwork coordinators should be knowledgeable about disability accommodations and disability policies. Okay, I didn't have that. And I think it's a lot to ask that a coordinator have that. I think it's a best practice. Let's just strive for it, and let's use resources if we as fieldwork coordinators don't know about it. I'm always happy to talk about accommodations, so you could always use me as a resource. Academic fieldwork coordinators should advocate for and support the student in the accommodations process. So, you can get a sense of how independent that student is and provide the assist level based on, how they're articulating their needs and all of that stuff. Transparency about the accommodation process. The school and the fieldwork site, keeping the student informed and included directly in the conversations about accommodations. I think sometimes there's conversations that go on between the school and the site, and you need student permission, to disclose accommodations, by the way. Um, and I think you have to balance how you're communicating um, about accommodations. And certainly if the end goal is to increase the students' independence and self-advocacy, include them in the process. But I think sometimes students felt like they weren't a part of, at least in some of the interviews that I did. Student engages in self-advocacy for accommodation. So remember, I just told you that that was a theme with the fieldwork coordinators, and that came up in this Delphi study too. The academic fieldwork coordinator, faculty, and students disability services office educates students about accommodations early in the curriculum. Great. I just said that in the last in my dissertation study too. So we're getting reiteration here. Next, the fieldwork educator, the academic fieldwork coordinator, and the school's disability services office support the student's decision about whether or how to disclose the disability and or accommodation needs. Help student weigh the pros and cons of early disclosure, understand the risks of disclosure, and respect the student's privacy. So just starting the conversation with, hey, let's talk about the options. This is open, this is safe. Here are the benefits, here are the cons, And I think in my experience, every student has disclosed in a timely way because I've always just been talking about it and keeping it safe. Um, but also I'm always like looking for sites that are like, you know, at least open, at least open to taking the student and learning. And I also try to meet with the site and the student over Zoom and really kind of discuss it because I'm automatically defaulting to the site probably doesn't know about accommodations, and how to implement them, what that looks like, and all that stuff. Um, the fieldwork educator, academic fieldwork coordinator, and student and school disability services office approach accommodations as an access and equity issue. And then the same folks conceptualize entry-level practice expectations in a disability inclusive way. I've definitely heard, comments about you know, like full-time versus part-time field work. And you can do part-time field work, and that's a student's right for that level of access for their education. They may have chronic health conditions that don't allow them to work 8 hours a day. Does that mean that they can't be an OT? Um, they may not get part-time in your site, but um, it's just to be a general entry level, they have to be a general entry level OT. That's the goal. So. All right, I'm just going to go over maybe one example, and then I think you'll probably have examples or questions. So I want to leave like a lot of time for that. Hopefully, you guys have questions. Um, all right, so we'll go over an acute care setting. So there's some cognitive accommodations that are being requested, specifically structured task lists and pre-session planning templates. I mean, that's an accommodation we can request. You know what? Another accommodation that is requested is written feedback. So, I tend to lean towards the student should be writing the feedback if the educator is giving the feedback, and that's like kind of the process. But I think it depends on the situation. But we do give feedback at the end of the week, right, in our feedback forms, but we know that there's a lot of feedback that's given throughout the day. And, from a cognitive processing standpoint, a student would benefit from that kind of written feedback to kind of help them recall and organize the feedback, later on that day or when they're writing notes and things like that. So that's just an example that I can give you. So just a mental health setting where the student has I think this example, communication supervisor. So I think this example, yeah, is pertaining to kind of some mental health accommodations. So providing scheduled check-ins with clear expectations and structured feedback. I wonder how many students would benefit from accommodations related to mental health. I have not had a student yet with one. And I imagine that check-ins would be very helpful. More check-ins than just like the weekly, just to reinforce this is what you're doing right, this is what you need to work on, just so that you can help the student um, focus on the objective data. So, oh, I wrote myself a note to talk to you about food and health related breaks. And I kind of mentioned it before, but if you have a student that needs accommodations for intermittent breaks for health, medicine, that sort of thing, in the interviews that I did, like I said, there were a few, four or so, where they needed those and they were not getting implemented. They were not getting implemented. And the students didn't feel empowered to ask. They were afraid to ask. Um, it's productivity too. Like we're all busy trying to get it done. And I think for me, knowing that I have these kind of old remnants of ableism, it's like, wait a second, we have eight patients. We need to see the eight patients. How are you going to get a 15-minute break? I don't get it. But there's a way to kind of modify the schedule to allow that, and there's ways, I should say, not just one way. So again, just keeping an open mind, but think about that. Like if you have a student that's, doing the food and health and or maybe they have POTS, and they're supposed to be like taking rest breaks for like preventative measures, or if they're symptomatic and some were just not doing that the way that they should have been doing it because they felt like they couldn't ask or anyway, just wanted to say that. Here are some resources. The bottom ones are probably the best. Ask.jan, that you could put in any diagnosis and they'll give you accommodations for that. Docs with Disabilities is a podcast. Oops. And the leading person in accommodations is Lisa Meeks. She's a physician and she does this whole initiative. She wrote a book. It's free. And the book is actually listed here at the bottom. You could download the book. It's great. One of the examples that opened my eyes to what we could do as OTs for students with disabilities is in her book. Lisa Meeks gives this example about a physician, a surgeon in a residency program that had low vision, and he couldn't see the thread to stitch. And they dyed the stitch for this resident so that they could do the surgery so he could see. It was pretty cool. So I just love that. There's a lot of things we could do. Okay, so let's go. Before we do the survey, we still have 20 minutes, I believe, right? 6:37, 8. We still have 20 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay. So I can see everybody. Hi, I see a bunch of just names and screens. Yeah, put on your camera. That'd be great. So, I just wonder if you would mind putting in what your role is. Are you an educator? Are you a coordinator? I think the survey probably asks that, but I would love to know my audience a little bit and just see where what perspective you're coming from. Oh yeah, Fieldwork educator, cool. Oh, Michelle's here. Hi. It's good to see everybody. I see some familiar names. Um, so who wants to start? Yeah, so most everybody is probably an educator, minus the consortium members who are here to support the effort, I guess.
I'll start, Courtney, if that's okay. Can I
Cool.
just make a comment?
Yes.
My name is Paige Tyson. I'm a New York City Public School DOE occupational therapist with elementary school kids in Brooklyn. Absolutely love my job. I've been doing it 25 years, and and I've been taking on interns for the last 10. Um, I have had a few accommodations, nothing like low vision or anything like that, more so extra time needed for the paperwork,
Hmm.
which is not a problem at all. Another accommodation, to avoid the hustle and bustle of that, it's very chaotic entering the school building. There's a lot of school buses. We have two schools in our building. So the intern was allowed to come 15 minutes later and stay 15 minutes later to be able to avoid those busy times to just manage, like, I guess, anxiety or just, you know, the hustle and bustle or getting bumped into or anything like that. I loved your presentation so much. I appreciate you, and even feeling your emotion, we feel it too. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Fortunately, when I had to do my dissertation defense, I did not cry at all. I was totally together, but sometimes I just can't predict it, you know. But that's great. I mean, I think for me, just hearing you say, oh, the person's going to come in 15 minutes late and end 15 minutes late, like that's so easy and it's so accessible. And we can say, you know what? How about this? You know, why don't you do that? Why don't you wear your headphones? And it's like the students probably going to feel so good about that. And also, like the big thing with the literature is that like we want these people in our profession. Like they are an asset that we cannot replicate. They provide a perspective and an experience that we cannot, I'm sorry, I say we, I'm not a disabled person. I don't identify with a disability. So apologize for that blanket statement, but yeah, we need to diversify. Does anybody want to talk about challenges? Because we can do that. I just assigned a student who's going to New York City in January. So thank you. Michael was the coordinator's name. Is so nice.
I had I had a fieldwork student come to, I'm a public school OT, and I had a student who actually got, um, I think her injury occurred during college. So she was new to using accommodations and not used to it. So I really found what you were saying about, students don't know how to handle it, and we're coaching them through it a lot because I
Yeah.
think she was hesitant to use her accommodations and often would want to plow through when she really needed to use her breaks. And I found the challenging part was really trying to coach her through it was okay for her to ask for her breaks because I could and we would navigate like, do I assign you a break so that you don't feel guilty, for using it? But I think
Yeah.
it was really challenging for her to even want to use them.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
so I think any and all of this information will be so helpful to as we're navigating through these things.
Yeah. So you're validating what I found. And,
Absolutely.
I think so. Here's the thing. I also have a passion with wellness and faculty wellness. And obviously, I mean, clinicians are burnout. I know educators are like, there should be so much more time provided to a fieldwork educator with taking a student, and that's a whole nother thing. But the point is that you're being an OT to the OT student. You know, um, there's got to be like a boundary there. There's academic fieldwork coordinators. We are here to help. So just know when to hand off.
Okay.
And I'm a very direct person. So I'm just gonna say, okay, student, like you need to once a day ask for a rest break because I need you to be independent in that, or there's also, we know there's OT resources, executive functioning and coaching, all this stuff. We have a couple of those resources here at Jefferson. We have a coaching like faculty member who like does coaching all the time, and we have a another like college student focused program that does coaching. Yeah, so we can, we can kind of refer out, or I don't know if that would really work sometimes, but we do have options and we could be resourceful, but I appreciate that experience and you sharing that. It's just, I think sharing in a community way is real helpful. I think it's moving us forward.
Courtney, it looks like we have a couple comments. Mabel says, I also serve with Ann Scott on NYSOTA Mental Health Task Force, provide support to NYCPS on OT fieldwork education and PT fieldwork students
Wow,
with
great.
neurodivergence or anxiety.
Wow. I
And
mean,
then Jeannie Coviello said, in my 15 years as an academic fieldwork coordinator, I have found school-based practitioners are the most accepting of students who need accommodations. Curious of this possibly being a finding in your research.
yes. So, first of all, it's kind of sad and surprising to Mabel's comment that I'm like surprised that there's somebody designated for that. And that's sad, because we should have that a lot everywhere. But good, I'm so glad that there's somebody out there providing that support for, that population. And Jeannie, I wanted to find that out because Rebecca Ozelli is one of the authors of two articles in the OT field that did studies on accommodations and they were good studies. Um, and so there was some kind of correlation with setting and whether or not those educators in certain settings found certain accommodations reasonable. So I was like, oh, I want to find that out too. I want to help reiterate what those things are because I do anecdotally have these feelings about mental health settings and school-based settings, just like you said, Jeannie. But I only had 45 participants and there was no statistical significance. So wah, wah, didn't find anything. I actually, the one student that I interviewed was in a mental health setting, and I kind of felt like, mental health can be flexible depending on the site. Um, Definitely depending on the site. But this one student that I interviewed that was at a mental health site was her educator was very, very busy. And the hallway from the where the group sessions were to the office was too far for the student. And the student had, I don't know if she had POTS, but she had something where that distance was exhausting her. And but also high productivity, the student got a sense that there was just high productivity. So it was hard for the student to implement, these rest breaks and things like that because of that site's requirements, which ironically was mental health. So you really, you can get a general sense, but every site's really going to be different. It's site specific.
Ann Scott mentioned, are the essential job functions helpful in terms of covering the full spectrum of job characteristics? And then she noted Ozelli's articles are
Yeah,
really helpful.
yeah. Yeah, and Matt Sullivan and Lisa Meeks just put out like a manual, like just last month or something, 2 months ago, where they give a lot of I tried to find it before this presentation and I couldn't find it, but they do a lot of like examples of accommodations. And Ozelli's is just very insightful. I think the Delphi study that I did, not to be like biased, but I think it has a lot of practical insights that are very applicable. So are the essential job functions helpful in terms of covering the full spectrums of jobs? It's not the full spectrum because it's just the essential ones. But if you're thinking about whether or not a student's going to pass and be competent, you know, or I should say, if you think about whether the accommodations are going to impact the essential job functions, if the answer is no, proceed. Now you're asking about the full spectrum of the job characteristics. How does that relate to the FWEP weight? Because that's our guidepost for passing, right? So if the accommodations are not impacting the essential job functions, go for it. Provide the accommodations, but the student still has to meet competency based on the FWEP weight. And again, remember, use that 12-week schedule. That's going to be super helpful to keep you on track with whether the student is progressing. I have not provided supervision to students who require accommodations, but I've seen a massive increase in anxiety. Oh my gosh, I know. Around fieldwork placements and how to care for themselves during this time, I've really tried to show our students that fieldwork and what counts as success isn't black and white. I have a student now that I really had to meet with, and I met with the two educators, and she is such a good student. She's prompt, she communicates, she's articulate, she's mature, she's smart, and she just she said, my mental health has never been so bad. She's in her second rotation. And I said, well, gee, I'm in the business of accommodations. Like, you haven't gone to a therapist because your field work is impacting that? Wait a second. No, we got to get you to see your therapist, right? And you can get an accommodation for that. You can get protected time to do that. We actually did it informally because she was like at week 8, and this was our last rotation. But it's so true. It's so true. I think yeah, again, that I think will fall on the educator because you guys are in the trenches seeing that. Defer to the coordinator, take some load off, in my opinion, and then we can kind of handle it on our end and do stuff like that. Okay. I really try to show our students after work. Yeah. What's this isn't black and white. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Gianna. It's just one of her slides, but it's really great. Oh, thank you, Jeannie, for adding the Jan thing. I've just saved it on my, I mean, this is more for coordinators, I think, or, if you have disability, but the Jan, I save that on my toolbar. Educator, it's also important to address the well-being of the fieldwork educator. I know it's a lot. And I think just taking a student in general is a lot.
Courtney, can I add to your story from before?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
So a personal story of mine, I had a very difficult time when I was a student for my first level 2 field work because my supervisor told me at week 8 that she has to worry about her productivity and she can't be held accountable for my learning, which was
Wait,
really hard.
can you say that again?
She said she had to be 85% productive during the day and couldn't be held accountable for my learning.
Your
But
educator said that as a
yes,
student?
my educator said that. And it really took a toll on me on my mental health as a student. And I realized moving forward that I didn't have a disability on my field work, but just really taking in the perspective of I need to advocate. But I think it was really hard for me as a student because I saw the fieldwork rotation as a class, right? Because at the college I went to, the fieldwork rotation, it was identified as a class with a syllabus, and I gave my educator the syllabus. She didn't look at it. My college had very clear expectations for every week 1 to 12, of what I should be doing. She didn't look at it because she said she didn't have time. So that was really hard. And I ended up having a different kind of path for my rotations, but I finished my second one. And my second supervisor and I had really good conversations in the beginning of what is the expected learning approach or style of, does the fieldwork educator want to lead and demonstrate and model things for me? And then I learn from them and then I try things, or am I just supposed to just jump in and apply what I learned from class and then translate that into practice? Which is where I think it got a little muddy um, with my first rotation. But
the point I want to that I want to ask you more is there any advocacy efforts? Sorry, there's noise in the background. Is there any advocacy efforts right now to make sure that sites that are accepting students have some type of like ACODE standard curriculum mandate? Because I find it really tough that some students have high fieldwork access, some don't. It's not always equitable, and I feel that it's the responsibility of the educator to make sure that they're meeting those high at least those ACODE standards. And I think it's also frustrating because for ACODE now, their standards are it has to be a qualified fieldwork educator with fading support, but what's the curriculum at the site to support that? Like what's the clear outline so the student has access to it? Is there any advocacy for that right now?
Well,
I know I threw a lot at you.
yeah. First of all, I'm sorry you went through that. Really
That's
sorry.
okay.
Um, I know you're a very special educator now. I can tell. So that's great. So
Thank you.
the ACO requirement for fieldwork educators that they have 1 year of license experience. That's it. Remember, I was
That's what
saying,
frustrates me. Is there anything we can do about that?
well, I mean, we can write to AOTA,
Okay.
and certainly, there's people in AOTA that do listen,
Okay.
um, and when you talk about expectations of the site, it is we have to, as coordinators, provide um, educators with the learning objectives
Hmm.
so that they understand and what the curriculum is. That's kind of like
Hmm.
another standard as coordinators we have to do to the sites. But like, I think where the rubber hits the road here for someone like you is to say, okay, well, what do I do with that? We at Jefferson, I don't know if every school does this. We have, you have the CEFWE. The CEFWE, has to be signed by the educator. We were like, gee, are we really going to get the information that we want from the students if the educator's signing it? No.
Hmm.
So we have a separate one that doesn't get signed and it's just on the educator. So
Got it.
the CEFWE of the experience is the longer one. It gets signed by the educator, but we have, um, yeah, then we have a very short one. That's the CEFWE of the educator. And, again, as a coordinator, I'm really trying to build rapport with my students so they feel like they
Hmm.
can come and trust me. I'm
Hmm.
sure there's plenty that just suck it up and are like you and they suck it up. But you should be going to your coordinator. And I had a student one time in Texas. I was very worried because she's so far away and I didn't know the site. And it was she just called me the second day. It was bad vibe. That
Got it.
okay,
Got it.
let's just go. Let's just go. I don't want to do this in Texas. You know what I mean? Um, so and then you can just advocate for more educators. I always tell my students, I can't wait till you get out in the field because I know you're going to be good educators.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you. So I will look into writing into AOTA because I would really hope that there's some kind of push to ensure that sites have some kind of curriculum to showcase this is what the students can access and how they will progress.
Yes, yes.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Would everyone mind, please, please, please filling out this survey to give me feedback? Because it's 8 o'clock already. I can't believe it. But if you could use that, that would be great. I don't know if we send it out in an email, but
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Goheen. This was fantastic. And everybody's questions were wonderful. I think we had one more question that we didn't touch on. Um, do you find the OTs who are supervising students with accommodations reach out to you for more support? Not to prolong the evening, but I just
yeah,
wanted to see if
yeah.
you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, so technically we cannot be biased. Okay, so I'm not going to do more support for one student that I wouldn't do for another. So I have to be careful of that, but I might check in on everybody a little bit more frequently for sure. Now, if the student and the site have identified challenges and the student has accommodations, if anybody is identified as challenges, for me personally, I am on it. I am on it. I'm checking. I'm meeting. I do so many meetings, I can't even tell you. I meet this site, I meet the, and sometimes it's a call because that's easier on an educator, but um, it, regardless of accommodations, if a student has challenges, I'm reaching out. But if they have accommodations, I'm not going to treat them any differently
Excellent.
unless they need
Thank
to.
you.
Thanks,
Thank
Brent.
you. All right. Thank you everyone for joining. And please fill out your survey feedback information. It'll give us good ideas for future presentations as well. Have a great night.
Thanks.